projects in developing countries, and she holds the PhD from the University of Manchester and has worked in numerous countries in Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And Rachel, she specializes in social protection, gender, conflict and fragility, food security, rural and urban livelihoods, rural development and agriculture. Let's give it up for her as well. Next up, I would like to invite Mr. Bjorn Johansen. He is a civil engineer trained at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, who for the past 30 years has worked with public works program in Africa, Asia, South Africa. At present, he is a senior engineer on employment-intensive investment at Regional Office of the International Labour Organization for Asia and the Pacific. A major part of his work has focused on the development of sustainable approaches for the provision of rural infrastructure, covering a wide range of issues such as strengthening the capacity of local government, private sector involvement, use of local resource-based approaches, and more recently also crisis response and climate change adaptation works through employment-intensive public works. Let's give it up for Mr. Bjorn as well. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Philip Late, who is the Senior Social Protection Economist in the South Asia Unit of Social Protection and Job Global Practice of the World Bank Group, and part of the global leader, which teams on social participation in the design of social programs, among others, in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Senegal, Mali, and Congo. He previously also worked on for the development of research group on determinants of poverty and inequality, poverty maps methodology, and microeconometric simulation modules. He holds a BA and an MS in statistics from Brazil, and MS and a PhD in economics. Now, yes, with that, I would like to request Mr. Prakash to take over and start the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome you all, distinguished participants in this Policy Dialogue Session 4. In this morning, we are going to discuss on the promoting productivity through social protection. Social protection basically is to protect people from falling below the poverty line and then ensuring their basic livelihood by providing support by the government and non-government actors. But how can we upgrade their status of living, standard of living, as well as how can we make the infrastructure or the assets that is created by public works program more productive, that directly and indirectly support to the improvement of life of the poor in society. That has been a very important question at present. Since there are many regions of growing vulnerability and risk in the society in this economically interdependent world, as well as different kind of risk in the society, for example, disaster, economic and financial crisis, and growing competition in the market and losing job and changing nature of job. So the spending of the government for social protection has been rising annually. It has been great challenge for the governments of any country to finance the cost of social protection, social security sustainably. Nepal is a developing country, and then it is also spending huge amount of money for social protection, but its resource base is very limited, and it has been great challenge of ensuring sustainable financing for the social protection. We do have many programs of social protection. If we see it in the ratio of annual budgeting and spending, almost 3.6% of GDP is the expenditure on social protection annually. it becomes around 8% of annual budgeting. We do have many programs, but all of them are not appropriate to upgrade the standard of living of the people, or they are just focusing on maintaining the people remaining above the poverty line. And in the recent year, government has trying to spend this social protection money in such a way that helps them to uplift their standard of living through creating job. And government of Nepal from the last fiscal year has started a national program called Prime Minister Employment Program, which we call in short PMEP. That is basically is a public works program that has objective of providing the unemployed people that have been identified and registered in the local employment service center that has been established by the government in every local levels that are already have been established, and that local level employment service center will have a kind of strong database that is employment management information system, which collects the data of unemployment people. At the same time, it also collects the information of available job in the market, both in government sector and non-government sector. Then government has program of providing those people who are registered in the unemployment center as unemployed a minimum employment of 100 days in a year. We do have Employment Guarantee Act that has a provision of providing every Nepali citizen minimum 100 days job in a year. And if they don't get a job of 100 days, then they are considered to be unemployed. And then the family of unemployed citizen is considered to be unemployed family, and the act has provision of providing them subsistence allowance. That is the 50% of the wage a person can earn by doing 100-day job that should be provided to unemployed family annually as a subsistence allowance. So government has prioritized to provide the job and then ensure the social protection through providing job. At the same time, we are very much cautious about constructing a useful infrastructure or the asset through public works that is implemented through PMEP. That's why our objective of PMEP is making the social protection productive means of uplifting or improving the standard of living of people. So today, basically, from this session, Government of Nepal and the Ministry of Labor, Employment and Social Protection especially wants to get the experiences and the best learning of the practices of similar kind of program of public works for social protection around the world. For that, we have invited 3 distinguished presenters here. We will have 3 presentations. The first will be on social protection and productivity by Dr. Rachel Slater. And after that, we will have another presentation that will be on public works program and how they can increase productivity of the most vulnerable. That will be by Yojon Yuans. And then the third presentation will be promoting economic inclusion for the poor and vulnerable in Nepal. That will be by Philips Liet. All the 3 speakers and presenters, brief introduction has already been done here. So now I would like to request to make a presentation to the Professor Dr. Rachel Slater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Namaste. Good morning. It's my job today, as part of this session, to try and frame the policy dialogue that we're going to have, to identify the scope of policies, programs, activities through which we might improve productivity using social protection, and to provide a kind of overarching framework for our objectives and the approaches that we might take. So let's move to the next slide. Oh, here we are. Sorry, I've just spotted the clicker. We're talking about lots of things over these 2 days. We're identifying lots of objectives that we might have for social protection. So in this policy dialogue, we're going to look specifically at this one, at productivity. We're not trying to say it's more important than any of the others, but we're trying to say it is a really important component of resilient and inclusive social protection. But what do we mean by productivity? Now, I've got this diagram of somebody looking a little bit confused, because I started with looking at dictionary definitions. So here we are, the added value produced by each worker, a measurement of output efficiency, and then a definition of workforce productivity, the ratio of a volume measure of output to a volume measure of input. And I felt a bit befuddled by all of this. And if, unlike Philippe here, you're not a senior economist, maybe you feel a similar way. So how can we make this more tangible and a bit more real in our work? So one of the things that Bjorn has said is productive work equals work that yields favorable or effective results. And to put that even in simpler terms still, I think for me, that really means people being able to get better jobs where they have rights in their workplaces, where they're able to get decent wages in order to be able to deliver the benefits to their families. Or people who work for themselves, for example, farmers, who are able to generate more income to support them and their families. So how might we approach this? We're going to hear a bit more about this from Philippe, but one way of thinking about it is this being about productive economic inclusion. So that brings us back to this idea of inclusion in the overall work that we're doing these 2 days. So actions that help people move up the ladder of prosperity. And there's a bunch of different ways that we might do this that are all listed here. And these are going to come out through the course of the discussion today. Now, I think one of the best ways of thinking about all of this is by framing productivity and productive inclusion across 3 axes. One is about the things that we can do in social protection that directly versus indirectly lead to productive inclusion. One is about the timelines, the things that we can do that will have outcomes in the short, the medium, and the long term. And one is an axis that goes from employment where we work for somebody else, perhaps in a big company at one end of the spectrum, and being an independent own account employment agent through entrepreneurship at the other. So I'm going to talk through these axes. We can put 2 of them together. So a first one that is about the short term versus the long term. And then a second one where we might have a direct impact on people's productivity through social protection, or an indirect one. And the situation we have at the moment is that we know lots about what happens in each of these boxes. Things that we've already heard about in the conference so far have been on the right-hand side, some of those longer-term impacts. So, for example, we can use education stipends or scholarships very directly to improve the productivity. By supporting kids going to school, we're able to increase their productivity, but in the long term, so that as adults, they're better able to get access to highly remunerative jobs. And then indirectly, for example, through targeted child grants that improve child nutrition, we're able to give children the capacity, remember we heard about key stages of brain development yesterday, to be able to make the best of their capabilities later in life. So these are the longer term impacts, and we're going to talk a little bit less about these today. What we're going to try and do is focus on some of those shorter term impacts that are usually more related to what adults do rather than children. So here's some examples. Directly and in the short term, we can use public works programs to generate productive assets. So for example, road building that allows farmers in remote areas to get their agricultural produce to market and generate income before it spoils. Or cash transfers that allow us to invest in small assets and help households generate livelihoods. So for example, households using a cash transfer to purchase drought-resistant or high-yielding seed varieties that enable them to improve their outputs. And the photograph here is from Humla in Nepal, and this is a woman who told us how she'd used her cash transfers to buy in bulk wool from across the border in Tibet. And she was able to use that to then start weaving and producing clothes that she could sell. So she was using small savings from her cash transfers to improve her productivity. The second example is about indirect and short-term impacts. So here, where social protection makes households more credit-worthy, they can access credit at better rates. And one of the critical examples in Nepal for this is where people can get credit to borrow to support migration for work, that in turn allows them to access a better job or a better paid job. And the social protection here gives people the security of income that makes it less risky for people to lend to them, so it's critical. And then again, indirectly, social protection enabling small but significant savings. So households are able to use savings for consumption after a disaster, and they avoid cashing in their productive assets. And a savings example here, again from Humla, this woman was able to use her savings from cash transfers in order to get herself as a listed tea house on the Great Himalayan Trail. And as a result of the social protection, has been able to find a new way to support herself. And she was only able to do that because she was slowly able to generate and save some money. And then finally, direct, and perhaps in the medium to long term, we can start talking about social protection plus. We heard a bit about cash plus yesterday in relation to those additional things that we might include alongside a child grant. But there are all sorts of ways in which we can combine social protection with additional program elements, both for children but also for adults. So training on financial literacy, access to microcredit, creating assets at the community level. And here the example is an interview with a savings group that was done in Bardia last year, where women are using social protection, but at the same time accessing financial literacy support to enable them to better operate in workplaces and in independent enterprise. So this idea of cash plus or social protection plus, it really helps us shift from looking at social protection as a safety net, something that catches people when they're falling, to a ladder that people can use to rise up and become more prosperous. And one of the useful things here is, for example, from a study by FAO that tells us about all sorts of different ways in which people can translate the things that come alongside social protection so they can really use them and leverage them to climb that ladder. But how do they do that? I want to pick up on the third axis now, where we have employment, working for somebody else, having a boss at one end of the spectrum, and then entrepreneurship at the other end of the spectrum. For me, this raises questions about whether in our social protection plus programming, we're tackling the supply side issues associated with employment. So what is it that people are able to provide to the employment market? Or whether we're trying to tackle the demand side. What does the market look like? How much demand is there for labor in the first place? Now, one of the things that we find is that a lot of cash plus or graduation approaches tend to be based on self-employment or entrepreneurship, not on helping people to get a job. So they're tackling those supply side characteristics. Do people have skills? Do they have work experience? Do they have a lack of land or capital or assets to enable them to set up their own businesses? But there are challenges to this model. So first of all, the willingness and capacity of people to be entrepreneurial. And a couple of years ago, I sat in a room very similar to this, but in Rwanda, and I asked everybody to stand up to see how many of us were entrepreneurs. And everybody stood up. And then when I asked who has a job contract of more than a year, practically all the room sat down. I then asked who had access to some sort of employment benefit or a pension, and practically everyone else sat down. Who knows where their income's coming from for the next month? Everybody was sat down apart from one PhD student. And it showed me that none of us really want to be entrepreneurs. So why do we assume that people living in poverty want that kind of life? Why do we think that they want to be out there on their own as entrepreneurs, and that, like us, they don't want a regular, stable job where they work for someone else that is relatively unrisky? And this brings in the idea that all too often, the entrepreneurship enterprises that we've established through some of this work are micro-survivalist strategies. People are able to survive through them, but they don't really climb that ladder to prosperity. But another way of doing that might be through employment guarantee programs. So these tackle the demand side barriers, like the lack of demand for work or weak labour markets. And I would argue that we need to pay as much attention to those as to anything else. So finally, how do we move towards all of this? Well, some of it is about how we improve the effectiveness of our existing social safety nets. How do we make them work better so that people can save through them, so people can access better credit at better rates? But the other elements of it, both protecting and promoting better jobs and livelihoods and strengthening program delivery systems, ask us to step outside of specific programs and think more about the systems in which we're operating. So, having laid out some of what we're going to talk about today and provided a framework for it, I'm now going to hand over to the next two presenters who are going to talk about much more specific and detailed examples and what we can learn from those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slater. Now is the floor of Jørgen Johans, the Senior Specialist on Employment Incentive Investment, International Labour Organization. He is going to make a presentation on public works program and how they can increase productivity of the most vulnerable.
Thank you, Prakash. Good morning, everybody. This session is essentially looking at some of the broad trends in the public employment and public works programs which have objectives of employing more people, which the ILO has been involved in during the last 30-40 years, and look at some of the lessons learned and the impacts, what we can measure and what is difficult to measure, and some of the typical type of works you find in these type of programs, showing some examples from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I need something here. There we go. Ah, wrong way. What happened? Do we have a technician? Oh, okay, it came back again. There we go. Okay. The ILO has been working with public works programs with the objective of generating more jobs ever since its creation in 1919. Not that long ago, I came over some historical documents which clearly showed the ILO's engagement in public works programs in Europe in the early years of the previous century. After the Second World War, when the ILO was created, there was a lot of focus on getting people back into jobs and at the same time reconstructing Europe after the Second World War. And so these type of programs is a very old concept, which we can actually find a lot of good lessons learned from back 100 years ago, actually, today. More recently, the ILO's been running an employment-intensive investment program. This has been operating now for the last 40 years, which came as a result of very many member countries stating a demand for support by the ILO, especially from developing countries, not only to advise them on how to regulate the world of work, but also addressing the growing challenge of unemployment and underemployment. The policies in this field was further formulated into the Decent Work Agenda, which came around some 10-15 years ago, and which is now also reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals. There again, we're talking about something productive, this time in the context of employment, where we're basically looking at people getting compensated for their work inputs with reasonable wages which allow them to support themselves and their household. In addition, the Decent Work Agenda looks at other regulations to protect the workers in the world in their daily work life, which relates to conditions of employment, and some of the other benefits which we discuss in the context of social protection. But as a start here, when the ILO talks about productive employment, they're looking at having decent wages which allow people to sustain themselves. That we've talked about already. When we're dealing with these public employment programs, there's basically two ways of organizing these. Here in Nepal, you have the Prime Minister's employment program, which is very much based on the experience from the Kanali employment program. These are separate programs where you have a separate line of funding towards public works programs with the objective of creating more employment. You can also integrate the same methods, the work methods that generate more employment using labor-based methods in the regular infrastructure programs of the government. If you can create more employment there, then those new jobs don't add any more expenses to the government annual budgets. And in the ILO, we've developed a lot of work methods and approaches which actually allow you to increase the employment by replacing a lot of the use of equipment with labor-based work methods and still get the same outputs in terms of quality, in terms of resilience and functionality of the infrastructure being produced. These methods are very much more appropriate for rural infrastructure works, but there's also a lot of activities you can carry out which are necessary also and in demand in urban areas. Since we've been working now with the Employment Intensive Investment Program for 40 years, we've had a series of impact studies and thematic studies which not only look at the impact of particular projects or programs and the inputs of the ILO to those type of programs, but also looking at what has been the general trend in terms of the impact of the ILO's involvement in these programs and the programs themselves over a period of 10 years, for example. Now, what we see is in terms of measurable impact, we see that the cash income being earned by the workers, which has benefited from additional employment being generated through these programs, are pretty much short-term. It's hard to draw strong conclusions on the impact these type of programs, although they can be very large, has on the overall poverty numbers in a country or in a region. But if we look down at the family level, the household level, we see very much of the effects which Rachel talked about in her presentation, that the cash income can be used for many purposes, whether it's basic services required by the household in terms of providing education for children, health for family members, or starting additional economic activities by investing the cash income into other income generating activities. On the long term, however, it's been easy to measure the impact of the infrastructure being produced. The infrastructure has varying degrees of quality depending on the circumstances under which it was delivered. But we do see that the type of works in general which is carried out in public employment programs are very much needed infrastructure in the communities where these programs have been operating. I think Nepal has a similar demand as in many other countries, that in remote rural areas there's a dearth, there's really a lack of quality infrastructure, whether it's sanitation, whether it's health, whether it's education facilities, whether it's basic access to reach these areas or to reach other areas from the communities in which people live. And there, these type of programs have a huge impact. The same happens, takes place, the same experience we can draw from low-cost settlements in urban areas. When these schemes do improve infrastructure, it has an enormous impact on livelihoods. Again, trying to draw connections to developments in terms of poverty levels is difficult because you can't draw a direct connection between the infrastructure improvements and its impact on poverty levels. What we do, however, know from these studies also is that where you have good infrastructure, these are communities which are normally better off than in areas where you don't have basic infrastructure. We've looked at communities, what are the social indicators in communities with very poorly developed infrastructure as compared to where there's good road access, where there's good school and health facilities. You see a difference in poverty levels. When we're building or designing public works programs of this nature, where we want to increase employment levels, there are certain success criteria, or you can call them performance criteria. We have a wish list of items we want to see happen in these programs. We want to reach out to the most needy. We want to provide adequate wages so people are lifted out of poverty or become less vulnerable to shocks and crises in the households. We also have ambitions of reaching out to particular groups which we know are disadvantaged, and we also make effective efforts to include women, and in some programs also we have special concerns for getting youth into employment. A big challenge in all these programs is to generate enough work that meets the demand in the job market and provide sufficient jobs for all the job seekers, whether it's in terms of duration of work and the number of people seeking these type of jobs. Eventually, we hope to graduate people out of these programs, which has been a challenge with many different attempts and measures. Still, we know in many of these programs, which have been running for quite a while, we see that some of the people working there today were the same people who also benefited from these programs 10 years ago. So that's a tricky issue. We also have ambitions on the infrastructure side. Very often these programs provide local government institutions with a big, substantial injection in their budgets. So for many local government institutions, a public employment program may be one of the major sources of financing they have for their local infrastructure. So of course, while this being the case, and knowing the demand for that type of infrastructure, we need to target the work schemes to what is the priorities in these societies and build it at proper quality and with the resilience and also the designs which reduces the maintenance burden in the future. We can combine these type of public employment programs also with other budgets which allow for the use of more materials, quality materials, and some amounts of equipment. Sometimes we need to spend some money on transporting building materials to the work sites. So if public employment programs can be linked up with other infrastructure programs, and you combine these resources, you usually get better results. Also, when you work with technical agency, you tend to get better results at the end of the day in terms of the infrastructure. A big challenge, as mentioned in the previous slide, is providing sufficient employment. And that's a challenge in very many public employment programs. You need a string of new work schemes, new infrastructure projects, and you need to schedule your planning process. So there's new projects coming online which has been approved by the authorities, which has gone through the democratic process and prioritization and selection process, and is ready to commence works. Budgets have been made available on time, and can they therefore meet the number of job seekers which you have to these schemes. That's a very tricky exercise to secure, because very often the agencies which are in charge of implementing these public employment programs are very often the weakest level of government institutions. In several of these programs, for example in India up until recently, the NREGA program, which is supposed to be implemented by the Gram Panchayats, they didn't have technical staff to organize and manage the infrastructure works. They got some assistance from other technical agencies and from the block and the district administrations, but on the ground they didn't have permanent staff which could guide the workers and organize the daily works they were carrying out. This has a big impact on the quality of the works, and kind of compromises the productivity aspects you want to see in these programs. You want resilient, durable infrastructure being built, because that's a high priority of the local communities, and in the long run also contributes to the livelihoods development you wish to see take place in these communities. Some gender aspects. I was asked to say something on gender, and with the time frame we have, I've presented one slide which makes a lot of injustice to this topic, because there's a lot of good lessons learned and good practices in this field. We know these days how to easily recruit and get women involved in these type of programs. In Nepal, we've had very good experience just recently. The ILO is working with labor-intensive routine maintenance works in 37 districts in the country, where we've had a women participation of 60%. Women have shown through studies to perform the same amount of work as can be achieved through the male labor force. We don't need any particular or separate work norms for women carrying out hard physical work on construction sites. They're quite prepared to work on the same terms as men do, despite the fact that they have large obligations in the household and also related to other economic activities in the household. So it's a big thing in many programs. Some programs use quotas to ensure the high participation of women. In other programs, they don't need quotas. They have other measures through early announcement and making it very clear to local communities that the program will be seeking a high level of inclusiveness for women and other targeted groups in societies to participate in these programs, and that works. Okay. Finally, I've just got some slides of pictures from various programs around the world which kind of describe the great variety of work you can be engaging in public employment programs. The first one is from not far away in Cambodia, when they started out a public works program using workers to carry out routine maintenance of provincial and district roads. Here they're shopping hand tools, which is a important preparatory activity. Here in Timor-Leste, they're using simple methods to set out the works, which works well. It doesn't need a university degree to become competent in these techniques, and they produce good outputs. This is from Pakistan, where you see some you find very good masonry skills in the mountain communities, which did some excellent work in a public works program after the earthquake in Kashmir some 15 years ago. We talked about linking up with other public works authorities and adding a little bit of equipment, and that strengthens quality very often. In Kenya, we have these ladies doing bitumen works with cold bitumen, which can be handled by manual labor, and you don't need equipment to actually create asphalt surface road. Here they do the same for patching in Guyana in South America. We have lots of work. We see lots of work taking place on water resource management. This is a dam reconstruction in Ghana. There's also a lot of work now starting to take place in relation to climate adaptation works. The weather is getting worse and worse. You need strong measures to protect existing infrastructure. Here's protection of wetlands, heritage sites, after the tsunami in Indonesia, urban works. Waste management is a good way of generating employment. Can we do the same here in Nepal? I think so. There's good experience here, and there's lots of reference experience from neighboring countries and other continents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Now we do have next presentation. Probably this is the last presentation. We do have Philip Lift. He is going to present on promoting economic inclusion for the poor and vulnerable in Nepal. He is the senior social protection economist, World Bank. Thank you.
Good morning, namaste. It's a pleasure to be here to add a little bit more flavor for this great presentation that we had. Because one thing that we have to keep in mind is that whenever we are talking about social protection, we have different objectives, multidimensional aspects of poverty vulnerability. So that means that to increase productivity, we should not be focusing in just one intervention. We should not be focused only in one group. We should not be focused only in our own sector, but we need to work together with the different sectors so that we can create the synergies that will lead us to the next level. So if you think like that, let's just think this picture to frame a little bit where we are in terms of productivity. Imagine that this bar is a continuum. It's from the bottom of the welfare to the richest. Okay? So if you think like that, there are potentially three groups. You have the bottom, there are the poorest. You have the middle, there are the vulnerable to poverty. They have the minimum, but they still are vulnerable. And you have on the top people that are somehow protected, but they can still do better. What we have to do in terms of increasing productivity is not only have an intervention to the bottom for the poor and vulnerable, but we have to help the bottom to move to group number 2. So it's like this link between group number 1 to group number 2, then from group number 2 to group number 3. So how sustainable we can provide this? That's where we are. Okay? So if we focus our interventions are only among the poor and vulnerable, we are talking about improving the effectiveness of the safety nets, right? So if we are talking about moving people from group 1 to group 2, we are talking about promoting better livelihoods, promoting jobs. If we are talking about going to the next level, we are talking about providing resilience. Resilience, economic shocks, even natural shocks, because we heard yesterday a lot about this. So how can we actually design interventions that allow us to go all these steps? It's very challenging. So productive inclusion is not about one intervention, it's about a strategy. How we can put these pieces together, working with different sectors to make this happen. During this presentation, Rachel presented already the framework. Cash Plus was presented by Bjorn. So I will focus a little bit on examples of the two levels and what works or not, okay? So first we are going to look about interventions for the bottom. Okay? Then we see how this will allow us to move to the next level, bringing the examples from the second group. So at the bottom of the distribution, these people, this population, what is the characteristics of this population? They do not have enough liquidity. They do not have the knowledge. They cannot have access to credit. So what we have to do to bring them to level 2 without providing knowledge, without providing inputs. So this is what we are going to see in terms of the Sahel example. So in the case of Sahel, that was this massive investment where the 6 countries from the Sahel, they started with a basic safety net. We are talking about a poor region, really poor region. There were no safety nets at the time, no cash transfer, nothing, only scattered interventions here and there, and the government started investing. They started with the cash transfer. Each country has their own specificity, so let's not talk about the specific, but it was geographically targeted, so only few regions could receive the program, and only few people inside that region could get it, because the budget was not enough to cover everybody, because everybody deserved. We are talking about a really poor area. So from the beginning, the programs were planned to improve the future generation. So all the interventions were cash plus. They had the cash part, and they had some mentoring, some human capital bring. So we had sessions where the population, the women, were brought together. The men, they were brought together, and they were learning about how to do better with your child, how to improve nutrition, how to save, how to invest, how to plan. They had like every 2 months a different session. The nutrition aspect was always repeated. The education session was always repeated, but every 2 months you had like a new topic, financial literacy, savings, just to promote this mentality across the board. These sessions were not only close to the beneficiaries of cash transfer, they were sessions, any beneficiaries. They should move to a next level, how to boost their productivity, okay? So based on that, it was created one strategy. Each country defined their own strategy. There were pretty much 5 big topics. It was not a blanket intervention repeated everywhere. It was really tailored to the needs. So there were a lot of assessment to understand the constraints of people before defining the content of each one. However, there were 5 big blocks. So block number 1 was about mentoring, group formation. Why? There is a lot from different sectors working at the local level. But the poor and vulnerable, they do not know about, or they are not organized to benefit. One example, agriculture sector in most of the countries in the Sahel, they have interventions for the big farmers or medium-sized farmers where they have matching grants. So you have to provide like 50%, make a business plan, have 50% of what you want to achieve, and the government gives you 50%, so you have your budget. So if you plan to make a $10,000 investment, you need $5,000, okay? What happened is that the poor, they do not have 5,000. But if 10 small farmers, subsistence farmers, they group together, they get the cash incentives that are being provided to the families, and they are mentored how to prepare a business plan, together they can have access to this intervention. And this is a very important because the intervention, you have two levels. One thing is like, do you have the assets? Do you own the assets? The subsistence farmer, they do not need to own tractors, inputs like that. But they need to have access for it. So if they are grouped together, one tractor can help one full community. They can rent. So just imagine, like, possession of the inputs that is not extremely necessary if they can have access to. Another point that was important under this micro-entrepreneurship training, psychosocial support, is that in the Sahel, many people, the youth mainly, they do not want to continue working in agriculture because they do not see a future. They are not motivated to go and work on the agriculture sector. So what happened is that they are more likely to make non-ag investment. So this coaching, this micro-entrepreneurship, was not necessarily for the ag sector. They were also planned to train the youth to help linking the products to the market. So it was like using the non-ag sector, but to make the linkage between the products to the main market. So the entrepreneurship was like trying to bring the two of the worlds together. The results, at the end of the day, this is in Niger. After 1.5 years, like 1.5 years, the results, beneficiaries, livestock production, participation in savings, all higher for the beneficiaries because they got used to the intervention. The intervention was a long-term plan. Was, as I said, a strategy, was not one program. Working with the agriculture, working with financial sector, working with access to credit, everything together, because the social protection was the link to bring these people to the opportunities that were offered already by the other sectors. If we move, this is another example, I will move to Brazil. So Brazil, we all know Brazil about the Bolsa Família program and the social registry, the Cadastro Único, everything looks great. Brazil has a strategy where they call Brazil with no misery, okay? Under this strategy, the main goal of this strategy was to protect a large share of the population, not only the bottom, but really everybody that would need some support. The fact that the market and the needs are different between urban and rural areas, they had a different strategy for rural areas than to urban areas. In rural areas, the main point was about how can we create the opportunities and the development in the local, at the local level, and use that to feed the government to provide service at the local level. In what sense? Beneficiaries of the Bolsa Família program, they had no access to water because the northeast of Brazil, the interior is really dry. So the first intervention that was a top-up to the Bolsa Família program was what we call the water tanks. So they were collecting water from the rain. So it's like you're just collecting water from time to time when it's rain because it's really a dry area. But that collects, so the water like a public works to build that. Then you had a second level that was building for irrigation. Not only building for irrigation, but we had NGOs training the beneficiaries about different crops, diversity. They were receiving information about more resilient products. And on the top of that, the government had at that time the school feeding program and also the Restaurante Popular. It's like a subsidized restaurant for the poor. So what the government did, the government became the buyer of the products produced by the beneficiaries. So they were saying like, you will be my provider of tomato, of onions. So they were buying the products from the population and using for the school feeding, using for this popular restaurant. This strategy is now being applied in different countries in Africa. In urban areas, there was more in terms about how to bring. There was a lot of training, a lot of interventions that training the youth, mentorship, but the beneficiaries of the programs, the Bolsa Familia program, or the people that are in the cadastro that is like vulnerable to poverty, not necessarily receiving the Bolsa Familia, they had no access because they could not pay the fee. They could not even go to one of these public institutions and do like a short 7 days training. So the intervention was created where the government was selecting the former beneficiaries of the Bolsa Familia or people that were in the cadastro to receive priority in the training. So they were not replacing the people that are looking for jobs and trying to be qualified, but they were giving the opportunity for beneficiaries receive the same kind of education because they could not afford. That created a new market where people started getting to the ladder. So it's like that's bringing the excluded of the traditional education training, TVET, this kind of, bringing the poorer or bringing the guys to receive this intervention. And that created a nice, I'll say, development at the local level with like training. It's really big. But it was missing the jobs part, no jobs creation, no psychosocial. So they created the program Progredir. So it's a new program under the same strategy where now people are being trained to get this intermediation between the private sector, okay, and the individuals that were receiving all the assistance from the past. So it's really like working with the family for many years, because first you are beneficiary of the Bolsa Familia, you're in the conditional cash transfer, going to school, getting better educated. Then you reach the secondary education, you continue in the program. Then when you go to college, there are quotas for university, and then there is the placement. So it's really working with the family in a continuous way. So this program is now, it was 2 years ago that they launched it, is still going on. And very successful, but a lot of work with the public-private partnership. So the public is looking for the private, saying like, what is the resources that you need? What kind of people that you need? Why you are not hiring them? It's because of soft skills, because of skills for the job, so why is not? And then this program displacement, you have professional skills, you have financial, you have entrepreneurship, you have like some basic mentoring, to remove this mentality that I cannot go beyond. Because that's the problem with many people. They are just discouraged about investing or taking a risk. So it's like a leap of faith, so the government is helping them. So the final example in terms of all the pieces together is with the agriculture. This slide Rachel presented. But a real example of this is like the combination of, as I mentioned in the access to credit or matching grant, is how you, in a same area, okay, so that in Mali, for example, there is a social protection and agriculture project. Agriculture sector, they are doing, for many years, subsidized fertilizer. But the poorer and the subsistence farmer, they cannot have access to it. On the top of that, they do not know how to improve their subsistence crop. Okay? So the social protection group, so the minister in charge of social protection, they are identifying the people and organizing the people between the needs. So the poorest, without any capacity of work, basic cash transfer, nothing. Poor, but with capacity to work, not organized or subsistence, cash transfer plus mentoring. Small farmer, but is still not organized, cooperatives, savings, potential, so they can provide the matching grant. And the agriculture sector is mentoring the production across the different levels. So there is no repetition, there is no duplication, but is one benefiting from the other experience. And this is working pretty well. So for youth and gender, that's 2 points. In the case of youth, like what we have seen across the board is that and Rachel gave a good example, like you ask people, who wants to be entrepreneur? Everybody wants, but at the same time, if you ask, do you want a job? Yes, I want a job, a secure job. Because the entrepreneurship, it's informality is what drives the desire to be entrepreneur, because you cannot find a job, right? But at the same time, in many contexts, not everywhere, of course, but what happened is that people, if you think about, we invest a lot, and when I say we, not social protection, but the government invests a lot on training programs, TVET kind of, okay? But many of the workers, they do not have the basic soft skills or life skills. They do not know that they have to arrive on time, how they behave at the work environment, right? So maybe just giving this kind of training, you help them to find a job. The apprentice, usually how many of us sit in a classroom trying to learn about the work instead of doing on-the-job work and training, right? So this is just an experience where soft skill, life skills, work placement, package of services, mentoring, this is tailored for the youth, this is tailored for the women. So you have a lot of, depending on the country, right? Again, in the Africa region, you have like the women, they are doing the work, as Bjorn said, like they are doing a lot of small work to keep the minimum consumption of the family, while the man is trying to find jobs or doing like scattered activities. If you get this and you bring these women together, they can be way more productive. So Jobs Club adapting the needs. In Burkina Faso, the women were not participating in the programs because they were showing up with the kids. They had no one to take care of the small kids. So while in Burkina Faso, there's a nice experience now where with the partners, education sector and NGOs, now they created like a small daycare at each working site. So the women can go with the kids, drop the kids, do the work, and the kids are being stimulated with early childhood initiatives. And on the top of that, when the parent goes to pick them up, they are also mentored about how to use the money, how to help the kids. So it's like creating the synergies between the two sectors. The concluding remarks, I can keep here because on the screen. The main problem that we face, I just want to highlight, is that to be able to actually be that productive, it's a package. As we add elements to the program becomes kind of like a Christmas tree, like a really can be a nightmare, and even for managing this. So how can we continue working and getting the results that we want without affecting the implementation? So scalability and collaboration of this are very tied together. We should not assume that social protection will solve all the problems. We have to coordinate with the other sector. We have to be working horizontally in the government to be able to do that, to reach a large scale. And we cannot think about blanket interventions. There are no one-size-fits-all for that. It's really like, we need to understand the demands, profiling, adjusting the services, tailoring. I'm not saying that is a different program per region, it's not that. It's just the package can be tailored for the needs. So understanding the needs of your population, it's very important. With that, I conclude talking about the importance of integration in the provision of services. So keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Now, we do have floor discussion, and we have 15 minutes allocated time. I would like to request who will be facilitating the microphone in the floor, and I would like to request to the participants to ask question mentioning the presenter to whom you want your queries being responded. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I actually am not sure who might want to tackle this, but my question is regarding the role of public employment programs in this changing economic climate. With reference to, for example, South Africa's expanded public works programs, there's this big debate on, having limited number of days or limited work opportunities that are allocated per person. And given the fact that the labor market is not going to be able to absorb the capacity that's available in the economy in the coming decades, and it's likely to only worsen, unemployment is likely to rise, how do public works programs then fit in, and do they have to be redefined? For example, South Africa doesn't have an employment guarantee provision in their constitution, but they do have this public works program that tries to provide some kind of income support. It was supposed to be short-term employment, but does that still make sense given the fact that people are not likely to graduate from that anytime soon, or at least majority of them are not?
I think, is it, let's collect some more questions, and I think that is better, right? One-to-one, or let's collect more, and then, okay, next one.
I have a small question to the last presenter from World Bank. I think it was, in practical world, I don't think it's graduating from the bottom poor to the higher up is that linear. Like people might come across with a lot of shocks and stress, and that lead towards the backslides. Do you have any idea, based on your experience, like how long it took for those programs to really help the poor people to graduate, so that they are more kind of ready for the enterprise, or even for the higher level of the well-being group? Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Benjamin Zeitlin from DFID. I have a question really for all of the panel. We had a very positive picture painted of public works programs from all members of the panel, saying that the evidence that they presented showed good impacts of public works programs on poverty, on delivering infrastructure. And I have a more skeptical view based on reviews of evidence. I've seen one recently by GIZ, another one from DFID, which show almost no impacts on poverty of public works programs. But yet that didn't come out in the panel, and I wonder if panelists can reflect on some of the mixed evidence there is in this area.
My question is, very nice to hear all this employment related thing. In Nepal, what we have noticed is, yes, as he said, there are such interventions that has come up. But the other fact is there is lots of political influence also. So in Brazil, how was it? Was it there or not? If it was there, how it was handled? It's a bit of a trouble here in Nepal as well.
One more, then we will respond, then again we will pick up the questions.
Thank you. This is Usha from UNICEF. So my question is, what takes precedence? And this question is for the entire panel. So what takes precedence? Is it the income transfer, or is it the creation of resilient, productive assets? And I think you'll probably say marry the two, which probably is a very good answer. But if we are marrying the two, why should the budget line for public works not be shown as an economic activity rather than a social protection activity?
Thank you. I think now it is better to respond. And first of all, I'll hand over mic to, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering whether I can link together an answer based on the questions. I think in relation to the first question and some of the others, it's really important to acknowledge that this has to be both a supply side and a demand side response. So one of the things that happens, particularly in Africa with social protection, is that because so much of it emerged during the HIV/AIDS crisis, where we had lots of skip generation households, so grannies and orphans in a single household, and so much of our social protection has been trying to support those kinds of households. We've started to make assumptions that it's all about the capacity of the household. So we assume that if there's limited labour in the household, then they're not going to be able to manage on their own. And by extension, we assume that if there is labour in the household, everything will be fine. And of course, when the problem emerges that you have identified, that there is a massive labour surplus in the labour market, it doesn't actually matter whether you've got labour to sell if nobody's going to buy it. And I think the key thing for me in terms of designing public works programs is first of all, that you need to think about tackling the demand side for labour at the same time as you tackle the supply side, because if you don't, you won't really get very far. But I also wonder, and I think this relates to some of the other questions about the kinds of impacts that we've had, whether it means being much, much clearer about markets and how assets are used that we create through public works in our design period. I think that there are a lot of circumstances in which that idea of precedence of welfare versus creating assets, and which is the greatest balance, isn't very well thought through. So we rush into public employment programs where we don't think carefully enough about the assets and whether they create some sort of sustainable outcome for people in that area or in the market, because we're so intent on the welfare element of it. So we're so busy getting money out of the door and into people's pockets through a wage that we don't think about whether the road that we've all decided we're going to build is going to be any use in the first place. We haven't thought carefully enough about how that road will be maintained. We haven't thought carefully enough about whether you actually need some capital equipment to build a decent road, and that trying to do it with people holding handpicks and shovels is not the best way. So I think for me, the key thing in all of this is making sure that we connect in our design the welfare objective and the productivity objective, and making sure we design the right kinds of public works and we think about what the market can bear in doing so. The final thing that I'd add is really that I think we're missing an opportunity in a lot of this. We had a session yesterday about shock responsive social protection, and I think quite often when we're just doing road building, we're missing the chance to allow us to support local communities in being more resilient to shocks by doing public works that do things like afforestation, that do things like soil and water conservation to prevent landslides. And so there, for me, is one of the ways in which you start to balance the immediate welfare impact with that longer term effect that we have the capacity to have.
Thank you.
Yeah. In regards to the expanded public works program in South Africa, there is a key feature in that program, and that is that there's no separate budgets for the employment generation they wish to see as a result of the expanded public works program. It's all integrated into the mainstream government programs, like in infrastructure, for example. I think they have some enticement budgets that, if they manage to increase the job creation above certain levels, there's a bonus allocation for more to the infrastructure budgets in those particular provinces. But the employment generation in the infrastructure works of the expanded public works program, that is meant to come as a result of changing work methods and approaches to the ongoing workload of those technical ministries. There has been a slight change since the start of the EPWP as a result of this demand for providing better results in terms of employment generation. They've actually managed to become better in managing their infrastructure assets, because they've discovered that carrying out routine maintenance, regular maintenance on this infrastructure is cost effective, and also it's a very good use of money, maintaining what you already have, and that's an area where they can generate more employment. There's two big components in the expanding public works program. It's the infrastructure component and their environmental program. These programs, they need, no matter whether you need to employ more people or not. These are public services which the government needs to provide. They don't have any ambitions of addressing the entire demand for employment in South Africa, because I mean we're talking about 40% unemployment, effective unemployment, or maybe higher, and the public works program is never going to address that, but it can contribute to the situation. And I mean, I think also there's very strong political pressure to continue it. I think they're now in their fifth stage of the program. So I think people do notice that there are more people getting employed, although they could do more. I've been involved in reviews of that program on a couple of occasions, and there's lots of potential to do more, especially out in the rural areas and also in the low-income settlements in the urban areas. Rachel talked about is there any impact of the infrastructure works? The honest question is yes and no. I mean, some places I observed some terrible attempts to build infrastructure in these schemes, while other places you see some excellent works. Back to South Africa, the environmental program they have there is fantastic. I mean, it's if you have the chance to go and visit it, then you see hope for the future in terms of environmental works. They have a very strong technical agencies with very competent people who know how to address climate change and the adaptations which are necessary, and they use the EPWP as a vehicle for carrying out a lot of this works, and that is really elegantly done. Also in infrastructure, I mean, some of the historical monuments in America was built through employment programs, and a lot of the key infrastructure in some of the wealthiest countries in Germany, in Europe, such as Germany, they built their highways, which are still, some of them, with their original pavement from the time they were built in an employment generation program. The ILO has good technical people which can prove that these approaches can be cost effective and produce quality outputs. It's a matter of how you organize the program very much. It's not the fault of the workers participating in that. You can motivate workers to do excellent work anywhere in the world. Thank you.
Okay, just I will touch just the two questions because I agree with the answer, so I do not need to add or repeat. On the duration, just one clarification. In this program, we are not talking about only interventions that bring people bottom up, but we are saying that there is a package. There are different interventions. It depending where you are, you have access to a different package. Okay? So if you are at the bottom, you can have directly cash transfer plus mentoring training. If you are in the middle, maybe it's just training and mentoring and access to it. So it's different, depending where you are, you have a different package. And the idea is to bring them, like moving from package 1 to package 2, package 3, package 4. How long do they stay in each one of the packages? There is no blueprint, okay? If we are talking about the poor, the chronic poor, I do not expect them to move and be self-sustainable or have like a self-sustainable income in 1 year. I need to have like a proper follow-up with this family at a regular basis. But I need to, all the time, to reassess their conditions to see where they are, to see if my policies are failing or not, to adjust the policy. So what my point is that you cannot have an intervention assuming that this intervention will last for 5 years sit in the office and assume that everything works. No. Every time I need to be in the field, I need to be assessing. Implementation failures, correct. Design failures, correct. So a proper mechanism for monitoring and evaluation are needed so you can adjust your policy as you go. It's a kind of trial and error in a way, like you implement something, you fix, you go to the second level. But the fact that they are part of one strategy, okay, then you can continue for life. Political influence enters in this aspect. It's not only in Brazil, like everywhere around the globe, when we talk about social protection to the poor, there is like this need for ownership, but also at the same time transparency, because we need to be able to work at the political level, but also work at the technical level. So in the case, not only in the case of Brazil, but in Latin America, this is pretty much how it works. There is a government, high level, so it's at the president level, that the strategy is defined. There is an intersectoral committee where every single sector knows exactly what are their roles and responsibilities for that particular policy. Okay? So one example, when we talk about conditional cash transfers, is not, in the case of Brazil, is not the Minister of Social Development, now changing the name again, that do the monitoring of conditionality, is the Minister of Education that does, because they already do that. So they have this partnership. So at the high level, you have this, a big buy-in from each sector, roles and responsibilities well defined. Then at the local level, they are the implementers. So you have like resources to do this transparent accountability in a way. And the government invests in Latin America, they invest a lot in terms of finding problems and bringing solutions. So you have a lot of audits of the overall process. So it's not coming from the journalists saying that, oh, there is a problem there. No, the government identify and put on the newspaper so people can understand that they are taking actions to reduce corruption, errors, and fraud. So it's really like a comprehensive package that they try to put in place to minimize, I will not say to eradicate, minimize political influence. Because the population, they understand, the population are also demanding the better service. So they ended up doing a good work.
Thank you very much. I think now our allocated time has been over, so we are going to close this session. Okay. As I got permission from the chair of myself as well, so I'm going to conclude myself this session here. First of all, I would like to thank the all international distinguished presenter here for their very fruitful presentation, especially Dr. Slater for introducing the concept of productivity and how we could think about it as we design the social protection program. Similarly, Mr. Bejon for sharing his and ILO's vast experience in public works and particularly how it can be best designed. At the same time, Philip for sharing how social protection can promote economic inclusion. The country cases presented here, they have been particularly interesting and useful to learn lessons in designing and implementing social protection program in Nepal. For me, and I hope all of you, this session has been incredibly useful. The key taken away messages I find here are social protection can play a role in helping the poor and vulnerable, their access the labor market and improve the productivity. Public works or temporary employment program with skill training can increase the earning capacity of poor and vulnerable people while building community assets that increase resilience to shocks. At the same time, economic inclusion programs that combine transfer, training, business support, and financial services can have significant and sustained impact on poor households' welfare and their ability to get out of poverty. Even to sum up all the presentation in a kind of figurative way, what I found here is social protection program, if they are tied up with employment that ensures productivity, have 4 side impacts. The first one is it directly helps generating income to the poor, that increases poor households spending in social services, for example, health and education, that improves developing human resource to the member of that family, which supports them to improve their productivity, and then improved productivity of an individual means more improved life standard by ensuring better income in their life. The second aspect is it helps generating skill at the same time while doing employment, and if that skill is tied up with concessional loan or seed money, that can promote entrepreneurship, which may create more employment, and that has also similar impact of the first point I mentioned here. And the third one is it also helps create asset through public work program, and the creation of productive asset means improving economic activity and then better and quality lifestyle of the people of the community. At the same time, quality asset creation means creation of more employment locally. And one most important point is that we have also a good experience, and the experiences of around the world shows that the employment-linked social protection program, and especially the public works program, has very positive impact on women's empowerment, and engagement and participation of women in public works program generates more employment of them. And women's empowerment means cumulative impact on changing not only the life of an individual woman, but her family and society in large. So ultimately, the social protection program that is linked with productivity or that enhances productivity will help uplifting the poor from their poor life standard to a standard of living that ultimately reduces the cost of government to spend in social protection. That's why every government can finance the social protection cost sustainably. If we talk about Nepal's experience, we do have long history of social protection program. At present also various ministries are implementing many social protection program. Moles has tried to link social protection program with productivity by implementing Prime Minister Employment Program as a program of ensuring social protection through employment. We have experience of similar public works program in the past also. For example, Karnali Employment Program, Rural Access Program, SNRTP, RCIW, and currently also there are other ongoing programs such as Tarai Madhesh, Samriddhi Program. But all of these programs were of very small scale, and they were focused on certain geographical targeting or certain class and group targeting in the society. From these all programs, we do have some lesson, as we also see in all three distinguished presenters' presentation, that they are very common lesson we have also learned as a challenge of implementing such program effectively. The first one is right targeting, how to target the beneficiary in a correct manner, and at the same time, sustainable upliftment of the poor whom we target and implement the program. At the same time, selection of the appropriate project. That's why that projects help to reduce the poverty in long term to the beneficiaries. Another one challenge of the public works program we experience is quality of the asset that is created by the program, and then one of the most important, I think, is justification of the spending of scarce resources. This year, when we implemented PMEP, we did have a lot of comments and criticism from different sectors, as well as the experts of this area, even from the political parties representative, about the rational use of scarce resources. So how to justify it? That has been used rationally. That is another challenge. And maybe this is unique, or I don't know, the same experience is there in other side of the world also. Politicization of the program. It means some of the political parties, when they are in regime, they may bring such program as a populist agenda, but after the change of the government, another government may discontinue the program, thinking that that was introduced by the previous government. So these are some of the challenges we are facing, and all the lesson we learned from the presentation and even from the past experiences of our own program, we will try to improve the public works program in the form of PMEP we are going to implement in the days to come. Finally, I would like to thank once again to the presenter as well as all the participants, and I would like to close this session here. Thank you very much.
One more time, thank you to all our speakers, and thank you so much to Mr. Prakash Sahel for chairing the session. Thank you for that elaborative and very informative expertise on targeting the various grounds of social protection. I request you all to kindly take your seats. Now with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a short coffee break. We will be back by 11:20. I request all of you to kindly check time and make sure that you all are inside the auditorium by 11:20 so that we can begin with the Policy Dialogue 5 on time. Thank you so much. Another information I would like to send it to you all. At 3:45, we will have discussions where if you want to be a part of it, I request you to kindly go to the registration desk that is just